forward.
Yeah. Right
during
here.
the presentation,
Down here.
During the presentation, we will keep folks muted. If you are called on or need to speak, feel free to unmute yourself. It's okay to ask clarifying questions. If Tim uses a giant word you've never heard before, you can raise your hand and go, whoa, what in the world is that word? What does that mean? That sort of thing. But if you have discussion or comments on the things that are stated, please hang on to those for the end. We'll have question and answer at the end. Feel free to enter questions into the chat if you know how to do that. That's perfectly acceptable. Hello, Donna. Make sure to give everyone a chance to join the conversation, including yourself. We're here to learn, not debate, not judge. So feel free to ask questions. We are not reading the book in order. As you noticed this past week, we read the intro, the foreword, the timeline, and chapters 7 and 11. And they're not even chronological to his timeline or anything like that. We're doing this topically, not in order. It's okay if you don't have the book yet. If you need a copy, let us know. Lectures and discussions will be recorded in case you miss a week. So, or if you want to go back and review something that really spoke to you. So with that, let me open us in prayer, and then I'm going to turn things over to Tim for tonight for our computer learning. I almost said episode. Sure, our computer learning episode 2 of this broadcast. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the great wide variety of people that you have placed in the world. And we thank you for the joy that diversity and uniqueness brings. We just pray that you would be with us in this time, in this space. Help us to learn from one another. Help us to learn from the kind and dedicated individuals who will be helping us step through this journey. We thank you for the witness of folks like Martin Luther King Jr., who we can look to all these years gone by and still glean wisdom and insight from his writing. Show us how we can use what we learn to better serve you and serve one another in the world. We pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ by the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, it is all you, Tim. And I'm gonna mute myself. You're muted.
All right, you should be able to see my screen now, I think. Okay. So this is an interesting topic. We actually, a coworker and I gave this talk to the seminary a few years back. I've sort of modified it a little bit for this form, but it's basically the same talk. This is interesting for this context because what this does is an exploration of bias and how bias occurs in learned systems, including us. But what's interesting about it is a lot of times sort of the biases that we talk about, be those racial discrimination or other things, whether they be conscious or unconscious, are ones that are very sort of difficult. They're challenging ones to talk about. This is a fascinating way to think about it because it sort of takes us out of it, right? So it gives us a lens to look at our society through and the ways that things function without us, without our personal emotional attachment to it, right? So that's basically why we're talking about this in this context here. And so I'm gonna start walking in. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what just machine learning is. It's kind of important to sort of understand the rest of the talk. I'm gonna go through this part really fast. So I will actually ask, this is one of those exceptions, please feel free to jump in and interrupt if you're going like, I just have no idea what you're getting on about. That's okay in this case because I'm gonna go fast. And if you feel like you're getting lost, stop me.
So I have, real quick, I have unmuted those who I muted. If you have muted yourself, you are invited to unmute yourself if necessary. If something loud happens in the background, please feel free to mute yourself.
Yeah, generally stay muted until you have to say something and then feel free to jump in. Then we're gonna talk about the ethics of machine learning and how we think about harm, and we're going to go in that section through a series of examples, and then we're going to talk about how this applies to us. So what is it? Let's talk a little bit about where these things are used first. This is kind of all over the place, lots of places you probably don't even think about. One of the cases machine learning is used all the time is machine translation. This is very, very widely used today. And what we see is we started off with sort of simple phrase-based techniques where this is kind of how you learned French or whatever in high school. And we went into things like neural networks, and they have gotten to the point for common languages like English to Spanish and English to French, where the translation, the machine translation, is as good as human translation for all intents and purposes. So sort of like one case where we see this. Another place is in places you probably never think about. So this is an example. This is actually the use. We published this. Google published this 4 years ago, I guess. Using machine learning to control how we distribute power in data centers or any very, very complex industrial system. And what we see here is a fairly dramatic drop in power consumption, sort of doing what the machines did. We use this in medical all the time. Actually, my prior job before working at my current job was working in the medical space and using a lot of machine learning techniques there, doing for assisted diagnosis and measurements and all sorts of other stuff. It's very common. But what actually is it? Well, the sort of core idea is here is teaching a computer how to do something without necessarily telling it how to do it. If we tell it how to do it, that's called an expert system. And so this is where we can sort of encode a series of decisions, a decision tree, if you will. You know, if the patient has a rash, so forth and so on, if the patient has a blood pressure within a certain range and they have the following blood work, blah, blah, blah. Those kinds of systems are expert systems, right? We can write out a decision tree. We can describe why all of those steps occur. Great. In that case, we don't need machine learning if that works well enough. Problem is that doesn't always work. A lot of times it takes way too much of the expert's time to do that. A lot of times things change too quickly. By the time the experts have figured out how to write down what they know how to do, the world has moved on already. A lot of times experts don't know how they do what they do. I had a great experience of this in my last job. Again, it was a medical device. We were building sort of digital microscopes, basically. We had this one problem, like this one device that was going to do this weird thing out in the field. We had like 3 or 4 techs go out and look at it. Nobody could figure out what was wrong. I didn't even know about this problem. I happened to be walking past a colleague's desk. I saw this weird image on the screen. I was like, what's that? He's like, oh, we got this crazy problem. I was like, oh, your microscope doubler is like stuck open. And he goes, what? And they had him look at it, and sure enough, I was right. How did I know that? I don't know. Right? I was just an expert in the system, and so it was the obvious thing that was wrong to me. It's not because I'm smarter than anybody else or I'm better. I just happen to know the system better. And a lot of times experts don't know how they do what they do. Right? This is a lot of times experts actually don't even know. There is no expert. There's no one who can tell you how to do it. The other thing that's interesting about this is that, and we sort of discovered this, what's easy for us is actually really hard for computers. It took us it's really easy to make a computer do advanced calculus. It's actually really, really hard to get a computer to walk across a room. It's really hard to get a computer to identify a cat or to know that a picture is of your child, right? Those are extremely difficult things for a computer, but they're easy for us. And one of the reasons is that we're all walking around with these super powerful computers on the tops of our necks. And the vast majority of our brain is devoted to those sorts of tasks. How do we actually learn? Well, the ways we teach computers are very much the same ways that we teach people and the way that we learned as children and still learn. We give names to these things. So unsupervised learning is basically Is there a reason you just muted me?
I was getting feedback from someone and I accidentally muted everyone. I forgot it mutes you too, even though you're a host. My bad.
Anyway, this is a way of sort of accumulating information about the world around you. We have reinforcement learning. This is a great funny picture. And basically this is often a negative reinforcement. Sometimes it's a positive reinforcement. And So this is, you do something and something goes really wrong, and you learn that's maybe not the best idea. We have supervised learning. A lot of times when we think about learning, this is what maybe pops to our mind, but actually this is a pretty tiny subset of the ways in which we actually learn and the ways in which we teach computers these days. And this is where we explicitly go through and we teach a child the names of things or how to do specific things. Why is this problem? Like, so why are any of these problems, walking across the room or whatever, hard? And so we'll take this example. Well, which of these images actually look the most alike? Right, if you keeping in mind that a computer really isn't seeing a pug, it's seeing a whole bunch of little dots with certain colors in a particular pattern. We talk about this idea of feature, and a feature has a very specific meaning to us in computer science, and it's some aspect of input that can be used for recognition or categorization or anything else. And we would say that two images are similar if they share lots of features. So we could identify something to the extent that which it shares reasonable features with other things that we know that share the similar sorts of features. So if we could identify what these lists of features are, we could know what cats are, we could know what dogs are, we could know what Gloria looks like or whatever. Computers are great at lists of things. Going through gigantic lists of stuff is one of those things that computers are great at. Walking across a room, not so much. Big lists, really fabulous. Here's the potential useful features for like doing something like a facial recognition algorithm. And you could probably keep adding to this list ad nauseum. The problem is, even this would not make a great facial recognition algorithm. And perhaps even more importantly, that's not the features we have available. Again, what we actually have is just a whole bunch of colors at particular locations. That's not really going to work. Unless the two images are literally identical, comparing the pixel values is going to tell you absolutely nothing about them. Well, how does our brain do it? Well, this is actually maybe more salient to this, this topic. Well, the answer is it's actually kind of complicated, and it actually visual processing alone takes up about 1/3 of our brain. And at the end of the day, what this does is it moves from a series of less abstract, more concrete, but more variable concepts where we're screening out shapes, edges, things like that in our brains, and moving to very abstract but fixed concepts, right? So this is where we get to the point of recognizing faces. And this is why, by the way, sometimes when you look at a bunch of rocks on a ground or something, you'll see a face. Our brains are extremely highly tuned to seeing faces, even when maybe there isn't one there. This is sort of like a visual representation of that same thing in our brains. We have a whole bunch of neurons that are useful for like screening things, and as it moves down, it moves into more and more and more abstract, but more and more larger receptive fields of that view. So we start off by having bits of our brains which are just responsible for like seeing the edges between light and dark. That's actually a big part of what your brain does. It just tries to find shapes in things. And then from there, it actually starts to categorize things, and it says, oh, this is chair-like, or this is face-like, or whatever. Well, we can train machines to do it in much the same way. And again, we have these things we call neurons, and at the end of the day, in the machines, all the neurons are doing is they're just little mathematical functions. They're not really doing a whole lot. They're taking some input, and they're doing a tiny bit of math to it, multiplying a couple of numbers together, and they're spitting out some other output. But what features should we extract? Should we be looking at edges? Should we be looking at face-shaped things? Should we be looking at round things? What is it that we're actually looking for? Well, we don't know. We know that our brain does this. We can sort of track the neuron flow through our brains and figure out that this is what's occurring, but we don't actually know what the brain is doing. We do know, on the other hand, how to categorize some of the inputs, and this is maybe one of the key things to understand. We know who these photographs are of. We know that this is a photograph of a different person, and we know that this is not a photograph of anybody. And so we can sort of categorize these examples by labeling them and saying like, okay, these things are Barack Obama, this thing is Emmanuel Macron, and this is a brick. So how do we do this? Well, we start off with setting up a network, a neural network of all these neurons, these little mathematical functions, and we just guess at the values. And we give it an input, and it does a whole bunch of math, and what it comes out with is complete garbage. It's total nonsense. Doesn't mean anything. So we know it's wrong, and so what do we change? Well, we change something. What do we change? Well, we just change everything a little bit. We can also think about this in the other way of like, what made it get the wrong answer? Well, we still don't know. So again, we just blame everything. And so we just change everything a little bit. And we figure that over time, as we get better and better and better at this, we'll start to get changes in the other direction if we made that guess wrong. This really works badly at first. The advantage of computers, though, is we can run this a lot. And so we do billions and billions and billions of simulations of these things. And after a while, it starts to do really well. And eventually, it starts to do really well at that one narrow little task. It's only learning how to do one thing, but it gets really, really good at that one thing. But at that point, we really don't know how it works. It's just a bunch, like we can look at the mathematical formulas, we can tell you how those numbers are being multiplied together or whatever, but they don't mean anything. It doesn't correlate to our understanding of like how you would recognize a face or anything else. And this really becomes a system very much like our own brains. You can explain what a pug looks like. You can know that when you see a dog, it's a dog. You can know what your children look like. But you can't explain how your brain does that. You have no idea. It just does it. It pops into existence in your brain as far as you can tell magically. And that's very much how these systems work in computers too. We don't understand those. We can understand how it got there. We just don't understand what it's doing at that point. And we can look at what it learned, and we can see that what we start off with is an input, and you've got sort of an early phase which is doing a bunch of edge detection, much like our brains do, and then it kind of goes on and on and on, and then you get all this weird sort of like filtery stuff that goes on in these different inputs. And what does all this mean? We can kind of see that this is looking at facey things. So I mean, that kind of makes sense, but there's all these layers in between, and they just don't, it's really hard for us to say like, oh, clearly it would do this, and then it does this, we just don't know. And knowing what each thing does doesn't actually help us anyway, because at the end of the day, knowing what, if you look at a large organization, knowing what the job of one person in that org does isn't telling you a whole lot about it. And just like one little piece of our brain, one little action of one neuron, whether it's a machine or our brains, doesn't tell us a whole lot about how the whole thing works. The other thing that's really important here is we've not actually taught it why things are what they are. We've only taught it how to correlate things. This is really important because we do exactly the same things. We imply meaning on things, but in reality, what we're doing is really good at pattern detection. And what's really fun about machine learning sometimes, and sometimes gives supremely surprising and interesting results, is that this thing will do a great job at catching onto anything that correlates, however irrelevant to the task at hand. If you've given it in the data stream and it correlates to the right output, it will latch onto it. This bullet here mentions a label scribbled on the upper right of each picture. That actually happened in an early machine learning system. There was this great case where they had all these photos, and the photos were labeled, and they were just little tiny like pencil marks out of a museum or something like that of all these old photos before they'd been scanned in. But they were still there in the upper of each picture. And so they trained this machine learning system, and I can't remember for like me what this thing was for. They trained this machine learning system on categorizing all these photos, and they were staggered at how incredibly well it did against the training set that they did. And then they tried it on a photo that wasn't in the training set, and the thing absolutely bombed. And they're going like, what happened? And what they realized when they actually started to inspect what the thing was doing was they realized the only thing that it was looking at was the little scribbles in the upper right-hand corner. What it had done is it had learned how to decipher the original archiver's shorthand. But it didn't look at the pictures at all because it realized that was just way more complicated, and the shorthand was actually much simpler. Let's get into maybe more of the heart of this talk, bias. So bias is the difference. We talk about like unconscious bias or what have you. At the end of the day, what is bias? Bias is just the difference between the expected value of a parameter and its true value. So if you expect something to be one way and it isn't, you have a bias. Okay. In machine learning and computer systems, bias represents an error due to an incorrect assumption. In our own lives, bias represents an error due to an incorrect assumption. And it can cause us or can cause the algorithms to miss the relationships that actually exist. Variance, on the other hand, describes how far a set of related values are spread out relative to their average value. That doesn't make as much sense, but the next slide will help to clarify it, I hope. In these systems, high variance represents errors due to the overfitting of random noise in the data. So if you have systems that have a lot of mixing between the values. You can have a high bias system where you make really simplistic assumptions. You can have a high variance system where you make overly fitted assumptions. And then you can have a correctly fitted system, which is not going to give you perfect results. But as more and more points start to pop into these systems, as you get more and more and more and more examples, a correctly fitted system will work the majority of the time. Let's talk about some of the ethical terms as it relates to machine learning. And I think any systems, we're going to be talking a lot more in this series about systems of oppression and systems of injustice. Well, these are like some lenses that we can look at any system through, not just machine learning. One type of harm that we can discuss here is what we call allocative harm. So allocative harm occurs when a system either allocates or withholds some resource, opportunity, etc., to a group. Okay. And this is very transactional in nature. In other words, this happens to someone, right? It's someone didn't get a loan, someone was denied a job, someone was, etc. Okay, these are sort of like things that happen temporarily in time. They occur to an individual. Now they might happen to a whole group of individuals, and that's where we try to pay attention to these things. But it also is explicitly that it is a series of individual things that happened to people in that group. Hang on, I seem to have lost my mouse. Nope. There we go. Okay. The other kind of harm we're going to talk about here, and there's a few others we could talk about, we're going to keep it to these two, is representational harm. So representational harm is where there are existing biases, there are existing forms of subordination or other problems within the culture or within a system, and that where this system reinforces those. And so this is where you get racism. This is where you have class divisions. This is where you have, gender issues, etc. It's important to note that a lot of times representational harms that already exist within a society are common causes of specific allocative harms, right? So we can see this easily. So if we make assumptions about a given individual's suitability for a job, that's a representational harm. But when we actually go to employ them, we are committing essentially an allocative harm against that person. We're going to do two different examples here. First, we've been talking a little bit about like facial recognition. Let's walk through a way in which one of these things develops. This is a little bit simplified, but it's actually pretty true to life. And essentially the example I'm showing you here really happened. But what do we need to create a system like this? Well, just like we talked about with children learning, we need examples. We need something to learn from. So what we need is a lot of images. And if we're trying to create a facial recognition system, not just a face detection system, we need to know who's in the photos so that we can find examples of multiple photos of the same person, so we can figure out what people look like from different angles. We need these photos to be fairly natural if we want this to work in any kind of reasonable real world setting. It's very easy to train photos on like perfect headshots with white backgrounds, but in reality, if you want this to work for your, snapshots of your grandkids, that's not going to be super useful. So what we want is photos, lots of photos. We want them to be labeled. We want them from the real world. There's this great data set called Labeled Faces in the Wild. It's got a whole bunch of pictures of a whole bunch of different people. And it's all derived from news sources. So we've got names associated with these people. So we can even track people over periods of time, right? We can see people in different angles and different lighting and natural settings and, in more structured settings, over the span of maybe decades even. And so this is great, right? We've got this great resource. Cool, we're going to train our system on this. First of all, it seems to be working great. So we give it a couple of pictures that weren't in our training set. By the way, an important note, sidebar for a moment. It's very important when you're testing a system that you have a training set of data that you give it, and then a testing set of data, and that you never mix the two. Because if you test on your training set, you end up with problems like we talked about earlier, where the shorthand notes in the upper corner of the image, you never know that it didn't find that until you test it with something that wasn't in that set. So it recognizes these two pictures as the same person. Fantastic. What about these two? Great job. Recognizes those two as the same person equally well. And then it recognizes these as the same person. Those aren't the same woman. It also thinks these are the same person. They are definitely not the same person. It also thinks these are the same kids. Clearly not. So what happened? Well, what did our training data set include? You can look at the percentages here. But basically what this tells us is that, unsurprisingly, the set does really, really well if you're white, male, and between 41 and 60 years old. Maybe even between 21 and 60 years old. That'll probably do pretty fantastically if you're in one of those categories. On the other hand, if you're black and very young, or Asian and elderly, it's very unlikely to do very well for you, especially if you're a woman. We just haven't trained it on as much of that. It's not that the system is itself racist. It's that the system has not seen as many people with those characteristics. It just doesn't have the depth of experience in order to understand how to draw differences between people of different backgrounds who look different at different ages. Why is this? What we've inadvertently done is we've created an algorithm that's based on how likely it is that someone who looks like the person in question appears in news media. So the bias that we're creating here is the bias of wealth and power, privilege, right? We talk about privilege, we talk about white privilege or whatever. That is bias, right? It is a bias that exists in the society, right? It favors one thing over another erroneously. But what we've done is inadvertently encode that, because that privilege, that bias, is encoded in the media that we use to train this thing. We didn't mean to do that. We didn't set out to do that, but it occurred anyway. And if you actually look in the real world, in real image recognition systems that exist, even today, even this, by the way, this data set that was compiled here was compiled about 15 years ago. Nobody uses it anymore for this sort of thing, except for in like classes and things like that in universities. But the real systems that exist today still have these kinds of biases, and they're actually really, really, really hard to get rid of entirely. You know, we can do much better at them. They've improved significantly, but they're really hard entirely to remove, because, you know, if you train on the population of the United States, for example, you know, over 50% of your training data, assuming everybody has equal access to technology, which they don't, is going to be of white people, right? 13% or so is going to be of black people. And again, that's assuming a totally uniform access to technology, which itself isn't true. So it's very hard to create training data sets that are representational of everybody. And it's a known problem, and it's one that is actively worked on, but it's challenging. What harm does this cause? Well, at minimum, there's representational harm, but it really depends on what the system is used for. The representational harm something like this would be for a system where you're sorting photos of your family and friends, or social media things, or things like that. But this can also cause real allocative harm and cause real harm to individuals. And we've had cases of this sort of thing occurring too. There are systems that try to match things like from crime scene photos from like CCTV cameras or things like that to image databases. We have things that profile people at airports, at border crossings, etc., for a wide variety of different things. Lots of different countries do this, including the United States in different places. And when these systems get it wrong, what you end up doing is accusing an innocent person of a crime, and sometimes even sending them to prison for extended periods of time. Do another case study. This maybe is a little bit more obviously how this is an allocative harm. So you're a bank. You want to create a system that can determine who will pay back a loan. On average, you make a certain amount for somebody when somebody pays the loan back, and you lose a certain amount, larger amount when somebody defaults on a loan. And then if we all lived in an ideal world, there'd be some wonderful magic existing metric that was out there in the world, like a credit score or something, which would tell you who was going to default and who was going to pay it back. And these would be totally separate like groups of people, and there'd be some obvious divide, and there'd be some easy way to measure who's going to do this. But the world's not like that, right? The reality is that for any given metric that we choose to use, there's going to be people who seem to be safe bets who won't pay the loan back, and there's people who seem to be very unsafe bets who are going to pay the loan back. So we create a system, and we can look at a sort of few different things to measure how our system is doing. So this is assuming a homogeneous population. So there's some group of people who won't pay the loan back, there's some group who will. We can't tell the difference, but we do have this one sort of credit score threshold here, and if we set it to some value, or whatever value we set it to, we can compute a few things. We can compute the correct rate, and so the correct rate is loans that got granted to people and denied to the people, loans who got granted to the people who would pay it back and denied to the people who wouldn't. The incorrect rate is loans that go granted to people who wouldn't pay it back but denied to people who would. Maybe the more interesting numbers are what we call the true positive and the positive rate. The positive rate is the percentage of everybody who applied for a loan and got it, whether or not they would pay it back. The true positive rate is the percentage of loans that we gave out to people who would pay it back. Okay, so it's basically from the error bar above, it's only looking at the error rate of the paying back part. What happens when we have a group that isn't homogeneous? We get this all over the place, right? So this can be young people don't have a credit history, right? So you might have somebody who's super reliable, who is absolutely going to pay that loan back, no questions, but they have no credit history. We have no proof of that. We have people living different lengths of time, different opportunities. We have children growing up in families without credit begin to develop credit histories later, right? So if you grew up in a poor family and your family never used credit and they bought secondhand used cars with cash and they never owned a home or anything else like that, they just weren't users of credit, the probability that you're going to start developing meaningful credit, at 18 is very low. You might not start developing meaningful credit, if ever, until you're 35, right? So what do we do in this case? Well, there's a few different strategies we could employ in this particular example, and for any other example we would care to choose, there's sort of similar ones. We could say, like, well, what if we just tried to maximize our profit? We identify that these two groups of people exist. We have some way of identifying which group somebody lands into, and we're going to just simply say, okay, we're going to set the scores to maximize the profit. In this case, we make a little bit more money, but we're holding the groups to different standards. We could also say the group is unaware. We are ignoring the fact that there is any grouping. This is if we just treat it as if the whole population was homogeneous, so we don't identify this. In this case, the orange group is actually, in a lot of ways, a more reliable group. There's less mixing between the people who won't pay back and the people who will, but they're actually being disadvantaged in this case. We could go for demographic parity, where we try to make the positive rate, in fact, the fraction of loans that we give to each group, the same in both cases. So for every 100 applicants, we make with 37%, 37 of those applicants actually get a loan. In this case, however, the blue group is at a disadvantage. They're held to a higher standard, and the true positive rate is actually worse. Or we could go for an equal opportunity strategy. This is where we try to match the true positive rate. So we try to ensure that in both cases, the people who would pay back the loans have an equal probability of getting a loan. In this case, the positive rate difference is the loan thresholds differ, but we've sort of chosen a different strategy. But which one's right? Well, that's actually kind of hard to say, right? There's merits to each one of those strategies for different reasons. None of them are exactly right. None of them are perfect. And at the end of the day, this is hard. The input data that we have is inherently biased. The loan score one is an interesting example because that's a real world one, right? We know that poor communities, communities of color, due to redlining and other issues that we're going to talk about later, have historically lower home ownership rates because for a long time, people who lived in those communities were systematically denied mortgages by the banks. There was collusion to prevent them from being able to purchase homes and develop wealth. Well, fast forward 50 years, and you start to see the sort of issues that causes, farther down the line. So a person who's my age, who is white, who grew up in a middle-class white family, the credit scores I should be expected to have are very different than if I happen to be black and I grew up in a different neighborhood. And that's just, there's all sorts of reasons to go into that. Again, we'll get into those in later weeks, but this is a very real world thing that happens. The demos actually, though, give us some techniques to think about this. Like, how do we create fair? How do we create just systems, like independent of machine learning or anything else? Like, how do we look at our own systems? How do we evaluate if they are treating the people who they are serving in a way that is just and appropriate? We can look at other things too. I know Carissa particularly loves this one. And this is one of those ways in which we can use to evaluate media and movies. And we evaluate how often essentially characters have meaningful interactions with female characters, how often two female characters have meaningful interactions, how often male characters have meaningful interactions with female characters. And what you find is it's very lopsided. And this is something that has sort of come up more in the last several years. And the study I link is, I think, one of the original studies that led to some of these observations. But it's, yeah, go ahead.
So this led to one of my favorite movie analysis tools, movies and TV shows. And it's not necessarily meant to gauge whether you're allowed to like or watch the movie or TV show, but rather to highlight the gender disparity in filmmaking and television making. So pick your favorite movie or TV show and think about, is there at least one scene in the movie in which two female characters have a meaningful conversation with one another about something that's not a man? Very few movies pass that. Very few, and preferably two named female characters. And you will be shocked by how many fail that. Almost every Disney princess movie ever fails that. I think we figured out Frozen does not fail that one though. But just check that out. It's an interesting way to see how
Rise of Skywalker
plays out. I know he argues that Star Wars are Disney princess movies because Disney owns them now. Princess Leia, correct. And that one does pass the test because Leia and Rey have meaningful conversations with one another about not a love interest. Yeah. Sorry, that was just test it out sometime. It's a fun little experiment.
The next part is, how does this apply to us? And first of all, it does give us this sort of like lens to view the systems that that exist in our societies through, but it also directly applies to us. The same sorts of bias that we see in image processing algorithms and loan algorithms and so forth apply to us as well. We learn from the same sorts of experience, maybe not as well codified, and our training sets are biased. We also, just like the image, just like the system that picked up on the little handwriting in the corner of the image, we mistake correlation for causation. This causes us unconscious bias, and it also causes something which there's a couple of other ones too, but it causes attribute substitution bias. And this is, if you've ever read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, he goes into this in some detail. If you haven't, you should. It's a great book. But what the idea behind attribute substitution bias is, we very frequently, and subconsciously, by the way, this isn't something we're doing in front of the mind, we take a very computationally complex situation and we use very simple heuristics to replace those complexities. And so this takes all sorts of forms, but unconscious bias is one of the most well-known. We are worse at understanding people not in our training set. Who do you spend all of your time around? Right? Cultures are complicated. People are complicated. And I said earlier that we are spending a huge portion of our brain, in fact, the majority of our brain is dedicated not just to raw image processing, but also the understanding of people, right? So we are incredibly powerful computers at being able to read people's facial expressions, at reading subtle cues of body language, subtle cues of vocal inflections, all of these things. We spend ridiculous amounts of processing power understanding each other through these things. The farther away somebody is from your core training set, the harder it is and the more processing power you need to expend to understand them. This is a direct cause of xenophobia and racism. So if we have to work harder to understand somebody, it's uncomfortable. It's more difficult. And even people who live in the same physical locations, right, often have very different cultures. And we know that due to either de facto segregation or forced segregation, Black culture has developed in parallel with, but not tightly integrated with, white culture for a long time. And you'll hear from Jason in future weeks around things like high and low context cultural differences and all sorts of other stuff. But these are cultural differences. And if you don't have the same normative like expectations for how a person behaves in a specific setting as somebody else does, you're going to have cultural conflicts that you might not even recognize. This is also a cause of things like hostile attribution bias. So hostile attribution bias is where we assume the worst about somebody's intentions or motives, right? So if there's somebody you're more familiar with and you see them behaving in a certain way, you might be more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt. If there's somebody you're less familiar with, you're more likely to assume the worst. We also trust things that make us comfortable, right? There is confirmation bias is a very real thing. So confirmation bias, for those who haven't heard of this is where you trust news sources, you trust facts, you trust whatever that confirm the things you already believe, regardless of the truth of those things. This causes blind spot bias. So blind spot bias is the belief that we are better at detecting our own biases than we are, and that we are better at detecting the biases in other people than we are. There's also this got a funny name, the Dunning-Kruger effect. So those of you who haven't heard this is a case where people who are supremely ill-informed are much more confident about their abilities than people who are well-informed. So this is why you hear people who know absolutely nothing about, on Facebook or whatever, like confidently saying that COVID-19 is a joke, whereas the people who are, medical doctors with decades of experience in epidemiology are giving you cautious, like vague descriptions of things. They're saying, well, maybe masks are better than nothing. I'm not sure, like that. Yeah, they're so steeped in the knowledge of how complex the system is and how complex the world is that it's not that they're necessarily second guessing themselves, but they are reluctant to make strong statements because they understand how nuanced and how complicated things are. Whereas people who have no idea what they're talking about are perfectly happy to make extremely strong statements about things. And one thing that's really important to take away is just like machines aren't doing this out of malice, but they are biased. We are also biased. We are subject to all of these effects. We can't avoid that. That's intrinsic to the way that we are built. That's how our brains work. One thing that Nancy shared last week, which I thought was really, really good, and it specifically relates to this point, is that surprising things. So anytime something that we are surprised by, it's often because we're learning something about it. It's something that broke one of the biases, right? We went into it assuming that we understood something about it, and we were struck by how wrong we were. She shared a story last week about going to a home of a potential student and the housekeeper being white and the family being Black. And it's not that she did anything wrong. Like she didn't do anything embarrassing or anything in that situation. She was fine, but she was surprised by it and she felt bad that she was surprised. But that's actually great. Like we should revel in those experiences where we go into a situation and our preconceived expectations are challenged in ways we didn't even anticipate, and we're struck by it. Just like we mitigate this in systems and machine systems, we can also mitigate this in ourselves. There's this great book, Thinking Fast and Slow. We'll add links to this into the resources page. One thing that we found, though, is we can correct for these biases with time. So a lot of these biases are based on computational shortcuts our brains take. One of the ways to get around this is expand your training set. This is meet or work with different people from different backgrounds, if to the extent that you have the opportunity to consume media that maybe is it you for which you are not the target. And Curacao have examples of this, of some places you can do this. Like seriously, just like follow YouTube channels of for people who are very, very different than you. Explicitly identify biases, right? These can be challenging to do within ourselves, but we can introspect and realize that we all do these things. Like identify situations where maybe you're walking down the street and there's a couple of young black teenage boys or something like that, and you were uncomfortable, and you go, why was I uncomfortable? Like, what were they actually doing that made me uncomfortable? And the answer is probably nothing. And so being like introspective on that and analyzing like, okay, like what could I do to like react differently in that situation? It's not that necessarily you did anything wrong to them, but like what can I do to react differently in that situation? Like be critical of yourself. When you're actually forced to make decisions, explicitly think through criteria ahead of time. Don't rely on gut instinct. Your gut is absolutely your enemy here. Whether this is a hiring decision, whether this is interacting with somebody in a store, whatever, but like think through, like go through in your head, like, okay, I'm going to look them in the eye and I'm going to pay attention to the ways in which they're interacting with me. These are all analogs to the stuff we talked about for machine learning. This is increasing our training data set. This is trying to analyze ways in which the biases exist in the existing data and trying to come up with like representational ways to change those. But they work on us too. We're very similar systems. And that's really all I had. My hope is that this will stimulate some discussion. So, I don't know, Carissa, you can take it from here, I suppose. But
yeah, why don't you go ahead and unshare your screen so we can see each other, and I will open up the floor. Just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll let Tim call on you. It may be one or the other of us that will answer it for you, but depending on what the question is.
Because I can't actually see anybody.
You can't see anybody?
Nope, I can only see you and whoever's talking.
You're in speaker view, that's why. I'll call on folks. Go ahead, John.
Tim, you had said that the facial recognition software has gotten a lot better, but it still has issues. So in general, obviously you're never going to get 100% compliance with any of this, right? But what would you say is how far away are we from getting to that kind of almost acceptable range?
I mean, honestly, it works extremely well now, and for the vast majority of people, it will work correctly, regardless of background. The challenge in a lot of ways these days becomes one of, and this is again ways in which societal systems are expressed through how these things work. One of the big ones is, so for there's two actually contributions here. So black faces particularly, camera manufacturers have up until very, very recently, and when I say recently, I'm talking 2018, quite recently, done majority of their portrait testing with white subjects. And the sorts of color correction that's required to actually correctly render darker skin tones was just sort of ignored. And so in a lot of cases, it's that the necessary image data to be present in the image is often absent. And that's a challenging factor. So independent of how the image system works, if the data is just occluded, that's an issue. Just like any image system wouldn't work very well if you cranked up the exposure on your camera and took a picture of your own face with a flash on, and you'd be like a t-shirt and a white blob, and the system would be like, I got nothing. I don't know. So there's systematic problems like that. There's also access to technology. So a lot of these systems now are, we talked about sort of a trained system where you have an existing labeled set, and then you've got a training set. And the reality is most systems these days are active training systems where the label, they work over the sets as they are relabeled. So as you put a label on a photo, in Facebook or whatever, their image learning system is saying I know who that person is. I've got a bunch of other photos of that person. Let me go retrain on those. Well, the use of those social media systems is highly biased again based on class divisions. And so if there's just a lot less training data for black faces or whatever, it's not going to be as good at those because of the reduced level of access to that technology. These are all things that are gradually getting better over time. I know a lot of the big companies, including Google, have like huge, outreach efforts and things like that to try to like increase the level of technological access around the world, not just the United States, for all sorts of different communities. But they're slow, right? And that will take a long time to get the level of like, data depth that we have for the people who are more privileged.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, even over the past 2 or 3 years, I've seen a huge difference in that sort of access around the world. Even, it used to be, a few years back when we were in Turkey 5-6 years ago. We're not in touch with anyone we met when we were in Turkey. But now when we travel places, one of the first things your tour guide or someone that you meet and talk to at a restaurant is going to ask you is, can we be friends on Facebook? And so that has changed dramatically, and in a lot of ways is really helping the system as well in being able to overcome those sorts of things as more and more diverse people have access to technology. Any other questions for Tim? That was a lot of data, and we're going to send the recording and possibly the slides to you all as well to look at later. Yeah. I love the part, Tim, where you, the computer expert, basically told us computers are magic.
Yeah.
That's what I tell people about them all the time. So I'm actually right.
Well, I mean, machine learning systems, I mean, it's a very interesting insight into how our own brains work, because there was this sort of early belief that we could take these, and by the way, the types of neural networks that we're creating in machines are still vastly less complicated than anything that our brains do. They're largely what we call single pass systems. So you've got your first layer of neurons, you got your second layer of neurons, you got your third layer of neurons, and so forth, however many, it might be 17, 18, 30 layers. But they kind of, all the information kind of goes one direction through it. In our brains, we actually have loop back systems. So it might go, oh, I did a pass here, and then it fed the information back earlier, and then it passed through again, and it fed it back earlier, and then it passed a little farther through, and it fed it back in the middle, and then it fed it through, and it stuck it down to this other system, which fed it back up to here, and then it passed through again. And that actually adds a huge amount of complexity to our brains. And our brains are, relative to the number of neurons in our systems, our brains are like, hundreds of thousands of times more powerful than a computer system with a similar number of neurons in it. But even within those systems, it actually gives us this interesting insight into our own learning, where we kind of look at like the structure of the brain, and we can see like which parts of the brain cause like different parts of like visual processing, other things, and but it's really hard to like look in and say like, oh, like this neuron does this, and then we build computer systems which are analogs to that, and we train it and it does these amazing things, and we look at it and we're like, we have no freaking idea what this does. It doesn't. We don't learn anything from it. So I mean, we learn from it, but like you can't look at this and have some deep insight of like, oh, now I understand how the brain does visual processing. You're just like, oh, it's just as magic as our brain is. Crap. We didn't learn much. So.
All right. So I'm gonna, if there's no other questions, some of the resources we're giving you this week that you'll see in the handout. There's an article called "A White Woman, Racism, and a Poodle." Read it. It's amazing. This woman with a standard poodle, a black colored standard poodle, discovered she was getting pulled over for no reason by police when her dog was in the front seat with her, because they thought there was a black man in the passenger seat of the car. Never got pulled over for any reason when she was alone, but sure shooting, she moved to this one town, and every time she had the dog in the seat next to her, she got pulled over. There's another one about one of those situations where facial recognition led to a false arrest. Kind of talks about that journey. I can't remember who I was talking to the other day on the phone or something like that. I am a strict, like, I don't like capital punishment. We can't have. And this is why I believe that whether you believe that's an apt punishment for certain crimes or not is irrelevant. We can't get it right enough to ensure that we're arresting and prosecuting the right people. So it's a really interesting one on facial recognition software getting it wrong. Also, feel free to call me idealistic for that sort of belief, but that's where I'm at on that. And then there's a link to the book Blink, and Tim's going to add one more link that I didn't get in there that I missed for that other book that he recommended. And I will add in, I found a great link recently, talking about expanding your data set. Especially now during quarantine. It's not like you can go out and find the local Black author book club to join, right? You can't like go out to one of the local AME churches or Black Baptist churches or something like that and worship with them on a Sunday morning, right? Although go on YouTube, there's your homework this week, is go on YouTube and find a local Black church to drop in with during the week. And just don't assess it. Don't decide whether you like it or not. Just be in it. Just listen and process, and just let it be the experience it is. And I found a great list of television, movies, documentaries, TED Talks, the works that are great places to dive in. There are some real gems on there. I had never seen the show Queen Sugar, and I am like eyeballs deep in the 3rd season of that show and in love with it. So they're just like, expanding the sorts of things that you're taking in by way of media and story and learning. Especially now when, like I said, you can't go out and seek new friend groups. You can't go to, specific things. So, what I want to do now is, we read through Romans 2, or that was at least on your list to read for this week. I'm going to read through Romans 2, and then we're going to talk about all of these things together. So learning bias, how we just learn. There's some cute memes going around of, little children of different races hugging. They're like, you learn this. Well, yes, you do. You learn this. This is learned, and it starts very young. So we're going to talk about Romans 2, learn bias, and Martin Luther King Jr., the stuff we read this week. They do link together, and we're going to try to find some of those links. So here is the text of Romans 2. There it is. That should be nice and big for you. I guess there we go, hit the share button. That makes it even better. Okay. There we go. Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. I'm going to skim some stuff about the law and Paul going on. Yeah, so we're going to focus primarily on that first part. And the author then talks a lot about letter of the law versus spirit of the law, and then goes into the circumcision debate again. The big takeaway that I want to grab from this particular passage, though, is the idea of Just because this is something that we learn throughout our lifetimes in a sinful world does not mean that it is something we should allow ourselves to continue in when we are challenged by the gospel. In other words, we don't get a pass just because the world is broken and we have learned our ways from the broken world. This is a challenge in Romans here for us to leave space for growing and admit that it's okay to go into those spaces and grow and change and learn even when it's difficult. So that's the real takeaway that I want to give you from that. As we move into the readings from this week, one was what I am sure is pretty familiar to many of you, or at least pieces of it are, the I Have a Dream speech. We don't often hear a lot of the first part of it. We get the crux, we get the pinnacle of it, but we don't often get the beginning of it. And then this section on nonviolence. I have two notes before just opening up discussion. The first is that in chapter 7, when King is talking about liberalism, he is not speaking about politics. He is not, the liberal conservative spectrum of politics did not exist at that time in the way that it does now, for starters. It had not become a divisive religious thing as people are trying to make it now. What he's talking about is liberal theology, which is a very different thing. And so he's talking about a theology that does kind of go, well, there's sin in the world. We can work to make it better, but kind of lets folks off the hook. So he's talking about a fundamentalism where it's sort of beating people to death with their sin and calling out everybody's individual sins and judging them for it, versus kind of given a pass. So I just wanted to define that specific term in there. He's not talking about a political spectrum at all. He's talking about theology. The other thing I wanted to say is every single name of every single author he drops in there, those people are all worth reading. That was my other big point. So now I'll just open it up. What things surprised you in what you read this week? What stood out to you? What gave you life? What maybe challenged you or pushed on you a little bit? How many of you had read the full I Have a Dream speech before?
Oh, before, no.
Okay.
Not until
Okay.
I read the book. I love that. I love that book.
Anything? Did Tim melt your brains?
I just think everything he said in that speech was just so moving.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he's talking there about how deep rooted racism is in our country, and how he's still seeing that America has not given people the promise of the equality and the freedom and the happiness that it says that it would. And that's some powerful, strong language right there. I think if someone stood up and reread this speech word for word, leaving out the end part that everybody knows, I think that they would make some people uncomfortable.
It's moving. Has anyone seen the movie Selma?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that makes me cry every time I watch it. I mean, it's just that people could do that to other human beings is just beyond me.
I just thought it was so reflective of today. You know, it has not changed.
The words have transcended time.
Mm-hmm. Which is a shame in a way, isn't it?
Yeah.
They shouldn't have. They shouldn't have to.
Uh-uh.
They shouldn't have to.
But nothing has gotten that better. I don't think,
John?
for Black people.
I was just going to say, if Martin Luther King were alive today, and obviously this is just speculation, but I'm sure he would be very active, you know, and for civil rights continuing. But where do you think he would stand on the whole Black Lives Matter thing? So I've seen there's some people that are, you know, African American, Black, that are actually very against that movement. So I'm just curious where you think, and again, I know this is speculation, but where you think he might fall.
Why do you think
I think it really depends on how you define Black Lives Matter movement, right? So there is, you know, originally it was just a grassroots movement where that was a slogan for civil rights. And I believe King would absolutely stand for that, you know. I don't know anyone who, when they say Black Lives Matter, their intent is to mean that other lives don't. What people are saying when they say that is that Black lives haven't mattered as much as other lives for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And now the way that some people live that out may or may not be, you know, that might be where some stuff gets questionable. But I personally don't know anyone who uses that phrase in a violent way. And I know a lot of people who've been out there marching in the streets. I'm a police chaplain. I follow the bulletins that come out from the Pittsburgh police, and at least 80% of those bulletins coming out for people who have been trying to incite violence at these protests are young white males. It's opportunistic kids who are coming in because they want to throw a few bricks and start some trouble. And you know, and King somewhere, and I can't remember where this is at, King somewhere says something about how he doesn't support looting, rioting, those sorts of
Right.
things. However, that is the language of people who are traumatized and hurting. And so not to glorify it, but to say this is a sign that something very, very wrong is going on in the world, that people are brought to this. So all that to say, I don't know where he would, I mean, certainly at the beginning, as this was a slogan for, like, we need to pay attention that we're not caring for all people equally, then I think he would certainly stand behind the meaning behind Black Lives Matter as an organization or a movement. I don't know enough about the official, you know, scope or anything of the Black Lives Matter organization itself at this point to make any kind of conjecture for that. Yeah,
John, are some of the people who are saying they're against that, are they against it because of the rioting and the burning of the building?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I you know, that's just little snippets and things that I've read and heard. I mean, you know, don't take that as gospel, but I'm sure though I'm sure that's part of it, if I had to guess. But
and
I think
some of those buildings that were burnt, they were white owned, and that's why they burnt them, because they weren't, I mean, that's what I heard or read, that they were owned by white people, they weren't owned by Black people. And some were owned by Black people, but so they burned them because they weren't really theirs, you know. But I think a lot of people who say that are just upset about the rioting and the burning of the building. Because
we also have to go ahead.
Everybody should be for Black Lives Matter. I mean, because we are all equal, and we should be.
Another thing to remember too is, and we will probably talk about this a little bit more in a later week, is remembering things like the Tulsa massacre, right? This is where the white people rioted in the Black downtown, and leveled it and killed hundreds of, I can't remember how many. Do you remember how many people it was, Tim, in Tulsa? And that was not a standalone situation either. Like that happened time and time in different places.
You mean the whole town? You mean the whole town? But that whole town was leveled.
Yeah. So in Tulsa,
400 people.
Yeah, it was like 300 people. In Tulsa, there was a place that they considered to be the Black Wall Street, right? It was very prosperous. It was a great area. And a young man was probably falsely accused of rape. It was in an elevator. The elevator could not possibly have been running for long enough for the man to have assaulted the woman in the way that she yelled. And his father, who was well off, went to go bail him at the police station, and they didn't want to release him on bail. And it started like a witch hunt after this kid. They were trying to lynch him and his family, and leveled the Black Wall Street area of Tulsa.
Everybody.
Yeah. It was horrific, and we don't learn that in our history classes.
We don't learn anything in our history classes that we should be learning. Really.
We try to sugarcoat things. I mean, even when we talk about the Civil War, we try to make it as pretty as possible. And it was ugly. It was very ugly. Yeah.
To quote the rapper KRS-One, is it history or his story?
Words to live by. Yep. Yeah.
That's another good movie. Glory.
Oh, yeah.
What?
Glory.
Glory, yeah.
Y'all, we're gonna have such a movie list after this, after this discussion.
And
I
it's
think
not
that's
like we have too many
great,
other
though.
things to do.
What a
That's
better
right.
time to have a good movie list. Yeah. Yeah. One of the ones that I'm gonna so please take this recommendation carefully. There is a documentary out there called 13th.
Oh, yeah.
It is about injustice in the prison system and in sentencing and all of that. Essentially talking about what they sometimes call the school to prison pipeline, right? It is really difficult to watch. I had to watch it in pieces. So you might need to start and stop it if you watch it. If you don't feel like you have the stomach for something that you have to start and stop, because like, let's face it, the world's kind of crazy right now, and I don't blame you if you're not in the mood for that. Then stay away from it. But we will give you a link for that, because next week we're going to be talking about criminal justice. Donna, I think you can, I'm sure you can get it on Amazon. It's probably, at least at one point was on Netflix, but Netflix rotates their
I don't
stuff.
have Netflix. Yeah. I don't have
Okay.
that.
Yeah. So check Amazon Prime, check Hulu.
I don't have those either.
Okay. You can even just look online, like look up where to watch documentary 13th.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do that.
Another good movie that I recommend is Just Mercy.
We haven't seen that yet. Is it really good?
It is
It is.
excellent.
Okay.
It really
That's on our list.
feeds into the things that we're talking about now,
Yeah.
about how even if they're not recognized, they're still incarcerated.
Yeah. So one of the things you could do, so one of the things I'm doing right now, making a point of, is all my like fun reading, right? So I get reading for work. So I read like commentaries on Revelation, which are super fun. But I'm trying to make it a point that all the other stuff that I'm reading right now is either by Black authors or is about race and race relations in our country. And that's one of those ways that you can, try to immerse yourself in something else. Try to, try to make it a point to seek out new experiences in that way. Tim, you looked ready to say something and you're unmuted. No, you're just looking ready to say something. Okay. He does that. Yeah. Gosh, if you want a good TV show to get sunk into during quarantine, check out Queen Sugar. Whew. That's been my new That's been my new one.
Special channels.
What's that, Donna?
It's probably
Yeah, you
on
were
one
getting-
of your special channels I don't get.
It's on, yeah, well, so it was on the Oprah Network, right? And I always think
I don't get
Oprah
that
Network,
either.
and I'm like, oh, Oprah, I can't with you. But now it's on Hulu. Yeah. So
I
there
did
is
watch Saturday Night Live, Zoom, church.
Zoom Church, isn't it good?
I don't make you laugh out loud.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments on the chapters this week, or how you think they fit in? I'm curious if you see how they might fit.
I think
So
I
let me
read the
leave-
wrong chapter this week. I think I read
Oh, you
4
might have.
and
Yeah,
not
that was
7.
Yeah, that was the wrong chapter. That's okay. You got to read the whole book eventually anyway.
Well, I will.
So I'll leave you with this. In 7, when he's talking about, he right at the very beginning is talking about his experience in seminary and his changing theology. He came from a very theologically fundamental background, and he got to seminary and thought, whoa, that's, and it swung completely the other direction, right? And eventually found a middle ground. And I find that to be one of the most powerful things about King, is that he was not stuck on one track his entire life. He was willing to listen to God. He was willing to grow and change. And he learned that by reading and experiencing as much as he possibly could. You know, he talks about reading Walter Rausenbusch. I've read Rausenbusch, and that would have been a huge painful stretch and possibly angering for someone coming from King's background, of a very straight-laced, more fundamental theology, whereas Rausenbusch is very much social gospel, very little Jesus going on at all, just all about what we can do to fix the world, right? So that's a very big change for him. And so that, you know, that's one of the challenges of things like this, is that it's really important to be immersing yourself in a wide variety of thinking, because that's how we grow and learn and change the most. You're never going to learn much by reading and listening to people only who agree with you. And that doesn't mean you have to believe everything you read, but read a lot, you know, like expand as much as you can. Yeah.
Expose
and I
yourself
think
to
that's,
it.
yes, exactly. And I
Expose
think
and
that's
then
what,
evaluate.
yeah, exactly. And I think that I mean, that was what Tim was telling us about expanding our data set, right? And that's what Romans 2 is saying too. You know, don't pass judgment on other people, because we are also flawed people. Yep. Okay, so for next week, read chapters 2 and let's see, what is chapter 2? Chapter 2 is, because we're going to be talking about the system of incarceration in the U.S. Jody Rayford is the director of the Foundation of Hope. It's an organization that we have supported as a congregation. I've done a lot of volunteering with. In fact, I thanked Jody profusely for doing this for us. He said, we can't even figure out in the records how long you've been volunteering with us, so it's like my pleasure to do you a solid. I was like, sweet. We actually tried to look it up once, and we're like, we don't know. It was like sometime before 2015 or so. Like, that's all we could find. Yeah, so we're going to read chapter 2, Facing the Challenge of a New Age. And we're going to read chapter 14, which is Our God is Marching On. That might be one that you have maybe heard or read excerpts of if you haven't read a lot of King before. So 2 and 14. And then also Isaiah 42, 6 and 7. You can read all of Isaiah 42 if you want, but we're really going to zero in on verses 6 and 7 of Isaiah 42. That's your homework for this week. And check out some other church services from other cultures.
For a second.
Check out, yeah, go ahead, Donna.
Is there an address where we can donate to Jody's organization?
Yeah, I'll make sure that we have that information next week after after he's here. Yep. It's a great program. I hope he tells us a little bit about what they're doing. If he doesn't have in his presentation a little bit about what Foundation of Hope is doing, feel free to ask him, because I'm sure he'll be happy to tell you about it. Yeah.
And what was the video you want me to watch? 13 something? What was it? 13?
If you can get 13th, it's about the
It's just
13th Amendment. Yeah, the 13th Amendment. That's the amendment that says you can't have someone as a slave. You can't make someone work for non-living wage unless they're in prison.
And that's the one.
So that's the catch.
And that's the one about the prison. 13.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just 13.
13th.
Just look for the video. 13.
Yeah, 13th.
Or
As in
13th.
13th. Yeah, as in 13th Amendment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, the 13th Amendment says you can't make someone work for less than a living wage unless they are in prison. And so it essentially allows us to use prison as
A chain gang.
essentially, yeah, chain gang, slave labor. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. It's a pretty gross system. I spent a lot of time around the county jail inmates. I have strong feelings about our system of incarceration. So,
Oh, yes.
yeah, Tom and I could go on for a long time about that. So, all right, friends. Well, I'm going to